Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the Reverse Shot Happy Hour. My name is Eric Hines. I'm curator of film at Museum of the Moving Image. And you have found us on our first 6 p.m. happy hour on a Wednesday. Thank you for finding us and following us if you've tracked our movements different times over the last bit of time. We appreciate your sticking with us. If you're finding us for the first time, welcome. If you're finding us on YouTube, welcome as well. We are doing these for the foreseeable future at 6 p.m. Eastern on Wednesdays. And of course, they will show up on YouTube a day or two afterwards where you can stay current with our conversations. At the museum, we want to from the museum, we want to thank you again for joining us here and for supporting us during all of these months that have overlapped with the pandemic, and they've been doing mostly things online during this time. And we also are just about a week and a half or so to go with our Kickstarter, which is helping us stay afloat during this time. So please find us and donate if you can. In the meantime, there are some reverse shot related perks associated with the campaign. So I encourage you to give if you can. But in the meantime, we're going to give to you and to the community by being present with you and to talk about film. And there are fantastic guests here as always. As always, we have our amazing hosts. They're editors and founders of Reverse Shot, Jeff Reichert, and Michael Koresky, and longtime contributor and filmmaker Farihah Zaman. And as always, it takes a second for them to show up.
Hello, Eric.
Hello, Jeff.
Hello,
Michael. Hey, Eric. Hey, everybody. Hey,
Hello.
Jeff.
Hello, gang. Hello, hosts.
How are you guys?
It's 6 p.m. for the first time. We always do this at 5. I feel fresh as a daisy. How do you
Really?
guys?
It's been dark for 18 hours or whatever. I tried to go for a walk during daylight hours, even though we all are busy and seem to have gone back to a pre-pandemic workload, if not more so somehow. And I was like, I'm going to do it today. I'm really going to do it. I'm going to feel the sun on my face. And it's like, nope, I got out at 4:30 and it's that's sunset. Yeah. I found myself Googling today, when is the shortest day of the year? Or that's winter solstice, right? So yeah. Just so I can start preparing myself emotionally, but it's further away than I'd hoped.
We've got a long ways to go.
I'm also, I'm self-quarantining. I'm about 3/4 into a 2-week self-quarantine so that I can see my family for Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I'm staying in New York this year, just not doing any family stuff. We've decided to lay low and play it real safe, which is sad.
That is the smart thing. And we'll be talking about Thanksgiving, holidays, family, chosen family on next week's happy hour, which will also be Wednesday at 6 p.m., which is the new time that we're going to try out for a little bit. Even though God, it is depressingly dark.
I might be like making stuffing while I'm on next week's Zoom. So if people want like a tutorial on stale bread, doesn't that sound thrilling?
I mean, it sounds better than anything we could talk about in relation to movies.
Well, today, I will let you expound upon this, but today we are not talking about families or food or any of those lovely things. We're talking about something equally lovely in a different way.
Well, the conversation around the theme today started from the fact that, over the last couple of weeks, we've toyed with how we find interesting or more open-ended ways to talk about political filmmaking, but we were not ready to do that. It was election week, and then it was immediately afterwards, and we're like, can we bask in this like modest celebration for a moment before we move on? So we've finally found an entry point and the fortitude to come around to this subject.
Yeah, and our song for today is sort of the Clash's Rudy Can't Fail is kind of an honor of the political moment right now, as people may or may not be following. America's mayor Rudy Giuliani is fighting the good fight in Pennsylvania courts. He may not understand the law. He's never been an election lawyer, but that is not stopping him from going out and presenting this idea of, how he thinks the political situation has played out following the election. And I think that what's happened in the past couple of weeks since the election, the kind of the denial, the creation of alternate realities, the fact that something like 30 to 40% of Americans and 70% of Republicans, believe this idea that the election was just kind of that there was some sort of fraud involved in it. The fact that alternate realities can be so created and disseminated, it of course got us thinking about how these, how moving images can function to affect the way we think about things.
I'm just curious, how did they ever come up with such an idea? Was there somebody in our political system somewhere who planted this idea in people's heads that somehow the election was fraudulent? I just can't, I keep trying to trace it back to a person, but I just can't find that person.
No, I think it's going to take many years for us to really dig in and sort of untangle exactly how we've come to this place. But
see, we laugh now, we smile now, but this has been a very, very trying time. And the faith that's shaken, and everyone's feeling that the faith has been shaken in our institutions is kind of across the board, depending on how you view this crisis.
And so, and since we're movie folk, like I said, it's got us thinking about, movies work on us in certain ways. And we're not just talking and thinking about documentary films that sort of ask us to look at an issue and change our minds about it, or, that sort of work in propagandistic ways. Narrative films can do the same kinds of things, and in some ways can be more potentially insidious by virtue of being seen as kind of, a narrative or a fiction, and how we are sort of absorbing messages that they're communicating. And so we have two really awesome guests with us today to talk about this. Bedatri Choudhury, who's a longtime reverse shot contributor and writer. And she's been here, I don't know, 2-3 times at this point on the Happy Hour. So she's a regular. She's
family.
She's got a more than 3 episode arc at this point.
And we're going to welcome for the very first time, all the way from, I think she's in Toronto, Canada right now, filmmaker Brett Story, director of Prison in 12 Landscapes, The Hottest August, writer, educator, etc. Hello.
Hey,
I'm so excited to see you both here together. It's just really delighting me to see your faces in my little screen boxes.
Yes, thank you so much.
My drink matches my shirt this week, I realized. Just wanted to get that out of the way.
Yeah, I also wanted to say that Farihah really is quarantining. We are not in the same room.
We just have a similar aesthetic, okay? Living that classic Brooklyn lifestyle. Well, I think it would be great if we could start by talking about, Brett, you have a new short film that's out that I think is A, wonderful, and B, suits the theme in a way. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah, sure. Also, thanks for having me, guys. It was really fun to get an invitation out of the blue to meet up. I think 6 o'clock is a good time because it's like the depression hour, it's like the time of the you're so exhausted by the day, you can't, like, the evening doesn't yet feel exciting, and it's started to get dark and cold, and I always have this sign of like existential crisis at this time, because I'm like, I could do something really valuable with my evening, but probably that won't happen and the day is over. So it's kind of nice to just instead meet up with all of you with a little gin and tonic in my hand.
Yeah.
And talk about films.
Well, we're thrilled that you're here. Thank you.
Yeah, so I can talk about this film, but it's I'll start by saying it's my first and hopefully last film made under COVID conditions, which was not the plan. It was meant to be this short film. It was sort of a commission, but it was an invitation to pitch a film with a theme for a series of films for Mother Jones Magazine, having to do with some aspect of gun culture. And I pitched a lot of different ideas. And I think some of them were, well, I don't know. It's interesting to talk about political films and what counts as legibility, because I think some of the films were too ambiguous in their politics in a way for the editors. But I ended up making this film, or pitching this film, about a sort of controversial new gun law called the red flag law that Colorado just passed. And the plan was to go to Colorado in April and film it. And of course, we all know what happened. So I ended up making this film remotely, which is to say I hired a cinematographer on the ground who sort of constructed this setup, which included an iPad that zoomed me into conversations with the founder of a right-wing militia, a Republican sheriff who's opposing this law, a survivor of domestic abuse, and a couple of other people. And I was tasked with trying to actually form a relationship and ask fulsome questions under those kinds of conditions about not just this particular law, but the opposition that it's incited among all of these, a number of county sheriffs. And very, very briefly, the basic thing about this law is that it's a way for people who think that someone in their life might be in danger of harming someone else or themselves using a gun that they own, to petition a court to have those guns taken away for a 2-week period. And my own interest in it was that it's one of the few mechanisms that's available for people who are in domestic abuse situations to have the guns removed from the home. So it's not, they don't have to wait till an abuse happens and to charge the person. It's more like an abuse, a serious harm might happen and this person has firearms. Can you take them away? And all of these sheriffs in this state, after the law was passed in January, appropriated the language of the sanctuary city to declare themselves Second Amendment sanctuaries and say, hell no, we're not enforcing this law. We're going to be a sanctuary for everyone who believes in the Second Amendment. And don't worry, we're not going to take away anyone's guns, even for 2 weeks. So that's what the short film is about.
Even if you've indicated that you plan to harm your domestic partner or anybody else around you.
Yeah, even if you're going through like some kind of episode or having some kind of breakdown or having suicidal ideation. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different conditions in which, you might just pose this immediate danger and it's a kind of just stopgap measure. The guns don't get confiscated for permanently. It's just temporary, but it's like so much else, symbolic politically.
What drove the approach to speak to such a range of people?
Well, I mean, I was thinking about, and maybe this will, relate to the rest of the conversation, but I didn't want to make just a straightforward, like, this is a good law and these are bad people for opposing it, kind of like film, which to my mind would only appeal to anyone who already, believes in or thinks they believe in gun restrictions. So I was trying to think about it in a little bit more of a complicated way. And at first it was almost overly ambitious because, I was interested in the way in which the language of sanctuary was being adopted by these sheriffs. One of the leading sheriffs that I feature in the film, his county is actually one of the places where there's been the largest outbreak of COVID during this period, and that's because it's host to this massive meat packing plant, and that meat packing plant happens to employ mostly undocumented people, undocumented migrants who are the ones that are getting COVID. So there's already like a kind of racial politics and a sexual politics, even with the sort of language and meaning of sanctuary, and that seemed more interesting to me to approach. And even like, it was like a little sensitive. I mean, that's a bit of a dumb thing to say. It's very, very fraught in my mind to be interviewing cops at this moment, and definitely to be interviewing right-wing militia. I mean, I have no interest in like humanizing a right-wing militia member, but I am always interested in sort of thinking about where people are coming from when they come into their politics. And I don't know, I think attachments to guns are really interesting because they feel really personal. And if you can't relate to that feeling, like I just fundamentally can't relate to that feeling, and that makes it worth sort of pursuing, why does this feel like it's cutting to the core of your being?
And it seems like your approach to your documentaries always comes from this sort of, well, this is how it's usually done, and this is not what I want to see. So I want to see a different perspective. Like, I'm just referring back to Prison in 12 Landscapes, which for those who haven't seen it, I think is one of the great documentaries of this era. I was going to say decade, but I'm going to go even further, because it takes an issue, what's usually boiled down to an issue, right? It becomes an issue documentary, an issue film, and makes it into something abstract and permeating about our lives and about what it means. This is mass incarceration, but it takes a very abstracted, interesting look at that. And that, I remember images and feelings and textures from that film so much better than I would something that would come across as more of a propagandistic documentary. And I use the term propaganda, positive or negative, but it seems like your document, you always take that step back and say, okay, how has this been done before? Like you were just saying about other perhaps gun documentaries, and you want to show it from a different perspective, which I think kind of also gets to the core of what we're talking about today. How do you get ideas across in these formats in which you're not making it seem like you're making persuasive documentaries, but actual art about things that are important rather than issues?
Yeah. I mean, I can't wait to hear what other people have to say about films that sort of have lodged themselves in their brains. I mean, there's just so many ways to think about political filmmaking, I think, but one that I guess is really basic for me as a maker, but also as a watcher, is that there's something about films that make me feel inadequate without making me feel shame that I actually really love. And by inadequate, I just mean like when a film like makes you feel like you need to have a conversation about it, you need to spend more time with it, you need to like read other things or just work through what you've seen and what you've heard. Like that's a sort of like way of feeling like it's not possible to just consume it and then get rid of it. And I mean, and especially the feeling of like, I've just watched something that's too complicated for me to deal with on my own, and I need to join with others. And that's like, I think that's political. I think it's political to feel like you need to join up with other people to work through something that you've seen and experienced. And I mean, also I just don't like to be bored. And I think that there's something really boring about watching stuff that you can guess the ending, but by what you've seen at the beginning, or you sort of know where it's headed and you're on board or you're not.
Absolutely.
What do you guys think?
I sometimes struggle with, so I know this is immediately getting into like your high school philosophy class or whatever, but like, isn't everything trying to influence you in some way? Obviously, the hand of the director is there in every part of every choice, and particularly in the editing. And on one hand, I like the idea as a filmmaker myself of I want to hear as much as possible and have a more complicated perspective on things and not make judgment. But sometimes struggle when the maker of someone with that approach describes it as apolitical or describes it as, well, I'm just here to listen. And like, I don't want to say anything about it. You know, that's like also what I appreciate about what you're saying, Brett, is you're not feigning a lack of perspective. You're simply trying to include a challenge of that perspective in the process. So like, I don't know, where's it, with every film, because I'm somewhat politically motivated and I do care about social justice, like question where the right line is. Bedatri, are there any other films that you I'd say, I'm curious if there are films that you would say like this pushed over the line for me in terms of like trying to influence, and sometimes even films where you politically agree and you're still like, stop telling me what to do because of the style, or something that you felt, you know, very elegantly brought an issue to your
I
brain.
think with documentaries, I mean, and this is always a problem, and since I work with documentaries, it's like, you know, sometimes you're told that you have to show both sides to this problem, or like, you know, and I don't agree with that at all. Like, you know, a documentary is not your textbook. It's not going to tell you A says this and B says this. What do you think? You know, it's not that's like really simplistic storytelling, and it kind of takes me back to what Brett was saying, that it's really boring storytelling. But, and like you said, you know what, when you give me the prompt, the first things that I thought were the first films that I thought of were um of course biographies are like the first thing that hits you, that, you know, who is telling the biography of whom. Like, you know, a British person talking about Margaret Thatcher can be very different from the way somebody from the, you know, someone from the colonies making that film might be very different. And same with anyone, same with Gandhi or Churchill or whoever. But the film that stands out to me the most is American Sniper, or pretty much anything Clint Eastwood has made. Is like, I just don't understand, like, you know, I felt so bad, like, you know, when like Bradley Cooper is staring at that TV with his PTSD. And then I was like, wait a minute, who am I feeling bad for? Like, this guy has killed children and like women, and like with his bare hands, as it were. So I think American Sniper is one of those films where I ended up feeling bad for the character, but then I took like 2 steps back, and like my politics questioned my feeling bad for um his character.
But you feel bad in the moment because of the tools of movie making. Like Clint, you know, we could debate all we want about how good or bad he is at this point in his career, but these movies are effective in a certain way. I can remember watching 1517 to Paris, and, you know, kind of being totally on board with this thing, and also kind of buying in to a certain degree to this, you know, the conceit that you might find in like a Robert Greene film, like, oh, I'm going to cast the real people in the story of themselves, you know, fighting these terrorists on this train. But then, like you say, having to take a step back afterwards and say, like, well, what actually is this doing, and what actually am I watching, and why am I being asked to watch this?
And I think it gets complicated because he takes something liberal people talk of, which is like PTSD, trauma, and then he puts that in context of what most liberal people are against, i.e., war. So it just gets very difficult to put these, and he does it very smartly, and which is why, you know, we all feel bad. We start crying when he does that, and then I just think it's smart, but also a little devious in the way he employs liberal language to talk about something which goes against all our politics.
What's so interesting is like what you're just, I completely agree with you about that particular film, but I could take the same description for a different film and say, oh, you know, that's what really made me think more deeply, is that I was able to see some sort of, you know, humanity or an explanation of why someone would turn to this kind of violence. Or, you know, I found this tricky too. You know, Jeff and I made this movie about how Steve Bannon is a failed documentarian, basically. And it's called American Carnage. You can watch it on Field of Vision. Should you be interested in seeing a lot of archival imagery from Steve Bannon's 9 stellar documentaries.
I think there's a 10th one
on the works. Well, get ready for some fabulous clip art and stock imagery. But yeah, like basically we went in talking about how, you know, we're making a point that the art that someone makes is totally reflective of who they are in their politics, regardless of what the words are saying. We should pay attention to what this said. He's a propagandist. And then fell into this like endless logic puzzle and justification process of, well, how is what we're doing different? How is what we're doing right now any different?
I think it's also worth asking if you're talking about a film like American Sniper, and so much of this Hollywood grammar, you know, the syntax, which is very strategically designed to confuse you. I very much believe that they're very unreadable as a rule, Hollywood cinema. And I think one good thing to ask is, when you're starting to feel some kind of emotional connection to a character such as that, to ask how useful is a psychological reading at this point of this character in this particular place. I find it always complicates matters in a way that if you rationalize, you say, this is what we should do. We should try to understand this person and what motivates him to be here. But once you do that within Hollywood grammar, it becomes very tricky and very suspect. So it's almost like you want there to be more of a veil between you and the character.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is part of why I feel like even the idea of propaganda is a bit of a misnomer, because there's a way in which the best propaganda doesn't appear as propaganda, right? It appears as American Sniper, it appears as The Hurt Locker, maybe, you know,
Great
like
example.
films that are actually totally don't appear like propaganda because they're actually just saying like what's already existing common sense, but that common sense is a problem. Like, you know, soldiers are heroes, like cops are heroes, and like the nation is more important than anything else or whatever. And so then, you know, the films that get called out as being obvious propaganda are the ones that are didactic, but also going against the status quo, like a later Michael Moore work. And it's like, I don't know, the word doesn't seem fair because, you know, it sort of obfuscates questions of power. And for me, that's also relevant to the, you know, conversation about, you know, humanizing subjects. I feel like there's still a difference between taking an already existing hero like Margaret Thatcher and humanizing her,
Right.
versus, you know, taking someone like, you know, an unemployed guy in his 20s who's joined a far right movement and trying to figure out what that's about. But it's obviously still tricky because, you know, even the, like, we just live in a like character saturated media universe. So it's most of the work of humanizing people is still just about like divorcing them from systemic issues and conditions.
And forcing them into like a very clean arc.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that these examples of American Sniper and The Hurt Locker are based on real people. And it brings me back to Bedatri's response to the prompt in terms of biopics and historical figures. And it's not that those are the only times, and we can, you know, we'll talk a little bit later about, you know, ways in which scripted films can just try to influence your feelings and thoughts, not only politically, but in that sphere, it's like there is an existing set of facts or let's say like a range of perspectives. And so the choice of we're exclusively using this perspective, and that completely reifies whatever, you know, systemic power hierarchy already exists in filmmaking and everywhere else. So that I think I notice it more. And then I think about all the biopics that I probably watch and I'm just like, sure, whatever, that was fine, great plain viewing or whatever. And then, you know, maybe I only notice when I have some additional knowledge about that person. Like Gandhi is a great example because his sort of maniacal and other sort of personal flaws, you know, that's not appealing to a Western audience, that part of the story. And then I think about, like I think I'm so media savvy, but what are all the times that I just allow myself to be seemingly innocently entertained?
I was having this conversation with a friend who is teaching a video production class. And he was saying that he's for the first assignment, his students were making these archival films, and a student had come in and made a sort of mashup film that was based on QAnon footage from the internet, but not in a critical way. Like basically, I mean, it was a bad film because it was basically just a re-edit of existing QAnon films, but in order to persuade her fellow students. And we were talking about, the conversation started out in a way that was maybe familiar to all of you, like, oh, who could believe in this stuff? And like, what's up with conspiracy theories and how do people believe in them? It's so preposterous. But then, and this is, a bunch of us who were in, I'd say, our early 20s when 9/11 happened, and all identified as people from the left. And we talked about that film. Was it called No Coins or Coins? What was the 9/11 truther film that Alex Jones made? I hadn't even remembered that it was
I have
out.
to say, I do not know.
I'll look it up.
I remember what you're talking about, but not the title. I'd forgotten that this existed.
It had coins in the name, and so we were like, we talked about that film, and I was like, actually, I remember, friends of mine, 20-year-old like punk rock friends of mine, pointing to this film and being like, but have you checked out this film? Like, there's, I don't know, like the architecture suggests that the concrete couldn't have fallen with that much poof unless it was an inside job. And so it is just like the question of sort of literacy and like how we become so savvy now that we would never believe one of those videos, whereas then we did, or how it, like, even the ideology is confusing. It's super interesting. Loose change, that's it, not coin.
Loose change. And I do appreciate that Martin needed to do it twice. He's like,
thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Martin.
So everybody knows the title is Loose Change.
But don't watch it because it's not real.
But it does have a hilarious Hollywood name.
Yeah.
That's like I understand what you're like. There's something about coinage or money,
Be like Dan Aykroyd or something.
Generic titles.
It was an interesting thing when we were looking at the Bannon films for American Carnage, the degree to which Bannon sort of employed that syntax, that Hollywood syntax, and the specific sort of like corner of the syntax that he was taking from is very much like the kind of Michael Bay, Jerry Bruckheimer world of filmmaking, but applied to documentaries like trying to get rid of Obamacare or convince you that like there's a conservative movement brewing in the heartland, which I guess he was actually right about, points for Bannon. But, the fact that these, if you take images and put them in a narrative context in a certain way, it just can do these sorts of things. It can convince you and your friends, Brett, that maybe there was something weird that happened during 9/11, even though clearly the person who's making that film, Alex Jones, is a raving lunatic.
But it's not like George Bush is like, not a raging liar as well, right? Like there's just a way in which if you're suspicious of power and you do have some sort of critique of media images, what position does that put you in terms of like how you can be a critical reader of work, especially when it's work that disguises its politics?
Right. It seems, obviously people are trying to write the history of images and media in the 21st century already, but I think it might be, we're still a bit too early for that, but I do think there is something about a complete destabilization of these sorts of things that has perhaps happened in our lifetime, maybe started happening a bit earlier, that has made it hard to know. And I think that's why there are so many people out there right now who are so eager to believe that the election could have been stolen from Donald Trump, even though overwhelming evidence suggests to the contrary.
There's another, not to keep plugging Field of Vision, but there is a short film by Charlie Line called Personal Truth that's about the making of conspiracy theory. He unpacks the Pizzagate passion. I don't know what to call it. The Pizzagate phenomenon. And, just sort of makes it relatable again, like how you find yourself believing in a storyline, because storytelling strategy is really powerful. And in the case of film, we've now reached a place where it's like 100 years worth of understanding what pushes people's buttons. And how that gets used even outside of film, right? It's some of the same approaches to like creating an emotional response.
As a documentary filmmaker, so I'm asking everybody in the panel to an extent, how do you deal with such a moment? I mean, I find this to be very overwhelming. I think most thinking people, that sounds rude, but you know what I mean, would think that this is a very alarming moment in our country's history. Obviously for what it means for our norms and for democracy and for what we would normally call truth. But when truth is so constantly being questioned by those in power, and I don't mean questioned in the way that maybe we would say that in a positive sense, but eroded, right? Confidence being eroded. How do you see, this is maybe too big a question, but how do you see the function of filmmaking, documentary filmmaking specifically, in counteracting that? because when everything becomes so untrusted, how do you trust even your own filmmaking? How do you trust the apparatus itself? Impossible to answer, perhaps.
I mean, I have some things I could say. Or some first thoughts. Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that I think about this, because like basically this is the question that obsesses me in a way. I mean, even with my own films, I guess I try and think about like appreciating that people have knowledge that can't, like that needs to be organized. And so I think of my films as like, or I try and think of my films as offering people the capacity to find a way of understanding what they already know differently. So I feel like that's part of the problem when you see like a fascist movement take hold, is that like, it's not that, I just think it's important to refuse the idea that millions and millions of people are just stupid or just racist or just something else. I mean, that's so condescending, right? So what if there's a way in which we're all experiencing crises all the time in various forms, and then we're looking for a way to make sense of that, and what's available is Donald Trump, like with a microphone going like, it's pedophiles in a pizza parlor that done it, right? So I do think that there's like, for me, I think that there's like an incredibly important role for film alongside journalism, alongside science, alongside human conversations, to increase our capacity to do something different with the knowledge that we already have, almost kind of like proto knowledge. And that feels different than just saying there's like truth or not truth, because I feel like that gets us stuck in, it gets us stuck in a really hard place. Like, so that's one way I think about it.
It's interesting to think of how in Prison and 12 Landscapes specifically, you used associative images as opposed to literal direct things you might expect to see in a documentary on the subject. It becomes a movie about things you don't see as opposed to the things that you do, and that reflects how mass incarceration affects everybody's life, whether they know it or not. I think that feels like it closely gets to a place of what we're talking about, right? Like, how do you actually address the permeating things in our lives as opposed to these hot button topics that are never going to be resolved on one side or the other?
Yeah, and I think even in the terms of the, that film, I remember when I would try and describe that film before it was made, and everyone thought it was too difficult and too challenging. And then when it already existed, I think there was one version of the response was like, oh, well, there was lots of really great response, but there was also some response that was like, well, I got it, but other people won't. Mm-hmm. And I actually think it's not that hard to get. So, like something like the scene in Appalachia where you find out prisons are being built on top of coal mines. Sorry, there's like a baby crying. Like to discover that prisons are built as a way to give jobs to people in poor, old factory towns or mining towns. It's like, it's actually not like a huge reveal or anything. Didn't take much investigation. And probably most people that live in communities like that already know it. So there's just a way of like, I don't know. I just think like part of the film was to express and make space for us to just see not only the prison system differently, but also to see it in a way that already expresses what we're already seeing, but we're just not trained to acknowledge or something.
That response is so funny to me. I've heard this too. The like, well, I get it, but it's just not going to work for other people, because it's a very like not putting yourself out there or taking any risk, because what you're saying is like, I get to continue to have this vision of myself as somebody who's politically and artistically aligned with you, while not actually, having faith in others to understand what spoke to me. And
I'm interested to hear you guys talk too about like the importance of legibility. Like, I feel like, Yeah, I feel like all of the films that I think of as the most like affecting films, the films that have had influenced me the most, are the films that are like the hardest to describe.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just, not because I'm like just love obscure experimental films, but because like people assume that legibility is the thing that makes something good. And certainly when it comes to political films, especially, like if it's going to be political, if it's going to have effect, it needs to be really on the nose. And I think actually like the opposite is true, but I'd be curious to hear you guys talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree in that it's sort of like, one of the, if we're going to talk about conservative media right now, its success and power comes from its legibility. It's utter legibility. There is no room for nuance. And if you sort of propose another legibility to set alongside of that, I don't think that's not really getting anybody anywhere. Because if someone's already chosen legibility to adhere to, they're not going to all of a sudden look at another and be like, well, there's another one. Maybe I like that one better. And so I think there is something about these approaches that are illegible, that take us in through different avenues, that sort of break things down and reassemble the pieces in certain ways that at least open up possibility, in a sense, for this question that we raised at the beginning, which is like, media images that like can change people's minds.
Or when you're making something that's, let's say, socially engaged or politically engaged, even if you wouldn't consider it an issue-driven film, there's often this question when you're fundraising or developing, which is like, well, what do you want to happen? And I find that like my true answer is not satisfying for people. And I think that's like, I'm talking about the beginning of the cycle in terms of what you're describing, Brett, where, the idea of what influence is meaningful for you. Sometimes the answer is like, I just want people to not look down on working class folks as much. Like I want people to feel differently or question a knee-jerk reaction to something that I discovered I had while making the film. And like that's never the answer that people want to hear. In terms of like, what influence are you trying to have? I think that even in that aspect, it's easier for people to try and think about a concrete effect or concrete influence.
I think also it's interesting how propaganda has become an aesthetic definition. Like, it's, something that's definitively not nuanced or not subtle. But I definitely think there should be a little destigmatization of the word propaganda or propagandist films, because I mean, yeah, shouldn't there be more propaganda against no, let me frame this up. Shouldn't there be more propaganda films that call for abolition of prisons? Yes, there should be. I do think I mean, like, I don't want to be this like pro propaganda person, but I also think the insistence on nuance and the insistence on subtlety should not be equated with something being propaganda or not, because like as we've spoken through the examples of American Sniper and The Hurt Locker, the fact that what makes it propaganda is the fact that it's not subtle. So I think that
sorry.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to think of, if you're thinking of a particular issue, right? And I'm sorry to embarrass you, Brett, by going back to your film again and again, but I was thinking of 3 different documentaries about mass incarceration and the very different approaches they took. So there's your film, there's 13th by Ava DuVernay, and there's Time by Garrett Bradley. These are 3 wildly different documentaries that have very different approaches, very different reasons for being, but they also all get at a similar political point. And I actually wouldn't throw any of them away. Like when I saw 13th at the opening night of the New York Film Festival, it was very rousing to be in an audience of 1,100 people who were getting a message very, very directly. And many of those people in that audience probably never thought about this before. In fact, I know that that's true. Yeah. And it created change in some ways. And I know that's true from anecdotes. And I agree, Bedatri, like there is a place for that, right? What do you prefer aesthetically and what do you think actually ends up moving the needle, and whether that's political, whether that's aesthetic is a question. But there is space for these different approaches to documentary, right?
Completely. I mean, again, speaking of not wanting to be bored, it's so frustrating when I see or hear filmmakers say like, well, this is the way you make a political documentary, or this is the way that you actually get your message across, and being sort of dismissive of other approaches, because like, I don't only want to see one kind of film. I don't only want to see the kind of film that I would make or the approach that I would take to the subject matter. And so I say in a way that is in no way insulting or dismissive sometimes, like, I would not have done that, but I'm really glad this film exists. Go ahead.
No, I was also just thinking about one of my favorite, like, I hope it's okay if I call him a propagandist filmmaker, or at least he's a very, explicitly didactic filmmaker, and that's Travis Wilkerson. And there's a way in which like he doesn't only like own that didacticism, but he's made it part of his style. So it's substantive and it's stylish. It's part of his aesthetic, and it's like so audacious and also affecting and effective, I think.
Yeah, I remember a film where I think there's a lot of Mayakovsky poems, but like nobody will look at that and say, oh, that's Russian propaganda. I really like Travis Wilkerson.
Yeah, I think that he's a great one to bring up. I mean, a lot of the filmmakers that I was thinking about who take such different approaches to political material include Sergei Loznitsa, right? Who, a Ukrainian filmmaker who's he's made fiction narratives, he's made straight-on documentaries, he's made found footage films, and that's what he's been doing more recently. And I find something like State Funeral, which is really just reassembled footage of Stalin's funeral with sound effects added and music added. I find that to be actually a really effective political film about now, even though it doesn't have any direct correlation, right? It leaves it up to the viewer to make that connection. I find that to be really impressive and sort of jaw-dropping. And I was also thinking of Jafar Panahi, the Iranian filmmaker, who, ever since his house arrest has not stopped making films, somewhat miraculously. And they mix documentary and fiction, but there's always the implicit politics of what's going on in this country that he can't actually say. So the politics exist in films in so many different ways.
Does anyone have, this is a category of film that I'm very fascinated by. Does anyone have examples of a film where you didn't necessarily agree with the politics or even think it was particularly good or meaningful, but it caused such a strong emotional reaction in you while watching? And I guess the part that I'm interested in is how you walk away feeling manipulated, because I can't, again, I guess as a filmmaker, I'm like, but what was it? What am I trying to pinpoint that's so different than what I think I would do, or that feels unethical or whatever? It's like sort of pushing your buttons for a response that's unearned.
I mean, to come back to Catherine Bigelow for a second, I had a really hard time with Zero Dark 30.
I was going to bring that up.
Because that is one of those films that it occupies, it's constructed itself in this register that we are, meant to accept as something that's related to reality. And then it just kind of like slips all of this really nefarious stuff, just like dribbled throughout the film, this ideas about like how the efficacy of torture, about, presumptions about people in the Muslim world, et cetera. But it is, again, it's packaged in this idea. It's like, it's a thriller. In a certain sense, it has that momentum that just kind of picks you up and carries you along with it. So you almost have to check yourself throughout. And I could definitely find myself in moments sort of losing myself for a second in the momentum, in the images, and the way the images and the sound were working together. And then having to remind myself, it's like, oh, wait a minute, this is actually incredibly distasteful and incredibly problematic.
Well, also it has that aesthetic of cool detachment. If you know that phrase, cool detachment, which is a complete misnomer in the case of that film, because it actually wants to elicit a response to you. But because it's so, it seems cerebral and detached, it gives you the sense that it's not taking sides and therefore that it has some sort of political value. I also found that movie to be strange because it impresses upon, we're talking a little bit about psychological arcs before, it impresses this weird psychological arc onto the main character. That's kind of, it's like a little subterfuge by the end of the, I think it ends with her, doesn't it end with her just crying, a close-up of her as tears come down her face, as though this was all about her experience in being a torturer. It a very strange movie.
Also, I think, I mean, what Farihah said, most women in sports films, I'm like, I'm rooting for them. I want them to win, like the Olympic or whatever they're running for. But then, after the film's over, I'm like, you just tortured her for years, like wouldn't let her sit, wouldn't let her drink water, or like complete dehumanization, degendering of this woman, just so like she gets this goal or whatever she's running for. I feel tricked by those storylines a lot, because when I'm watching it, I'm just like, yeah, run faster, you loser, no. And there is no second place. And when it's over, I'm like, wait, I shouldn't be doing that, because the coach is an asshole. Sorry, do we curse here? Like, the coach is not a nice person.
That's an interesting point about triumph. I mean, triumph narratives are always they usually have an overlay of dishonesty to them, or they want you to look past certain things. Oh, look who's back. Speaking of underdogs.
Do you have a film, Eric, that made you feel something while watching, and then the feeling you were left with was actually being horribly manipulated and upset about it?
Sure, I think often. I mean, I think Bedatri bringing up Eastwood is a good one. I mean, I think Spielberg is very capable of that, and Schindler's List. I think that's even come up in a previous happy hours, where a film that I could sort of feel simultaneously incredibly compelled and moved, while also questioning its decisions and questioning what it's doing to me and how. That's a film that comes to mind along those lines. But I think being able to have that experience and be a human being who can emotionally respond to something while also having some issues with how it's making you respond is okay. Like, I think it's okay, rather than sort of dismissing out of hand an emotional response we might be. Like, to be a human being who might respond to certain things is not necessarily the worst possible thing. But I was thinking a little bit about Bedatri talking about the sort of sense of just because there's something opaque, it's somehow better, or because the way that I think that complexity can be a style. The notions of complexity. I mean, this comes up in documentary filmmaking all the time. We should make it more. There needs to be a level of complexity here, as if that's an object, rather than actually like infusing everything that you're doing all of the time. And I think that that comes up in pitches too. Like, if you're going to try to get money for something, you don't quite know where you're going to get, but you have to know exactly what you're going for. You throw words like complex out there, because of course it's going to be complex. If it's not, you wouldn't be making a movie. But another movie we haven't talked about that is also Brett's, which is The Hottest August, or at least I don't think it's come up yet, is a film with a point of view, but it's a film that's entirely about asking people questions. Like, you can actually have a point of view and come from a place politically and also orient yourself towards asking. Like, you can still be curious in what people have to say, even though you have a point of view. And I think in general, that's not to reduce it to that, but I do think that the way that I respond to anything that's sort of making me think about things, society, politics, the way that everything works, as long as there's room for me to work myself into it, that if I can be a participant in it, it's almost okay if I don't agree with where it's coming from, as long as you acknowledge that I exist in the world.
Yeah, that's, I mean, Farihah, you were talking about the sort of different kinds of fine lines earlier. And I think like this fine line between creating space deliberately, because that's part of the politics and part of the way in which you want something to live in the world, and then inadvertently creating something vacuous, like, because that's the thing I hate most in a film, is to feel like I've been duped into having a strong reaction, or I have no reaction, but regardless, I've spent all this time watching something that exists for no reason at all, and has nothing to say. And I don't even mean say in a kind of, like, here's the message kind of way, but just like the person making it is not interested in things. And so, like, I don't know, I was one of the people that didn't watch The Joker, for all sorts of reasons, but mainly like when I was reading all the reviews, it was like the reviews that were like, this is a film that actually has nothing to say. There's the pretense of something to say. And I was like, that's the feeling that I resent most. But it is definitely challenging when, I mean, I certainly, try and make films that are where there's no hiding that I'm coming from somewhere, but there's there's a desire not to make the film so overimposed and overdetermined by my point of view that it doesn't make itself available for other people to live in and swim in some way.
Yeah, can verify that Joker is a film with no point of view. So
but the point is also, or I think this is part of what you're saying, about that the trappings of having a point of view when there is none is so much worse than this film is quite part of its aesthetic or strategy or purpose is a kind of lack of political engagement, or just intending a different kind of experience. I don't get mad at that. It's sort of like, well, I chose to watch this film and that's what it is, and I can like it or not like it, but I'm not going to be upset about it, as opposed to, you made me feel like this was about something and then ultimately it really was not.
Well, I think genre can come into this. I mean, I think that in some ways what you're saying, Farihah, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I might respond to an action film as a more honest expression than something like Joker, which is sort of creating this sort of supposedly this point of view about society, making some statement about human behavior and psychological motivation. Whereas somebody could be coming from a different place from me politically, but that's very clear in the way that it's using the genre of action, say, or horror. And that, in a sense, at least I know where it's coming from, and I can choose to watch it or enjoy it or what.
I keep coming back. I know we're running out of time. It's already 7, but I keep coming back to something that you said earlier, Brett, about people assuming that other people won't get the things that I get. That's super fascinating to me. And I think about that sometimes when I think of the movie Hale County this evening, which really had legs, for lack of a better term. Like that's a fairly, I think of that film in a similar way that I think of Prison in 12 Landscapes, because it gets at its subject matter in such a kind of abstract, roundabout, but still very emotionally direct way. And that movie seems, just taking a step back, to be impenetrable or difficult or however, but that movie spoke to people. Everywhere I would go, people would be talking about that film. It got an Academy Award nomination. I think we have to start trusting people to see the movies that they are interested in without putting categories or boxes around them. I think of that movie a lot, actually. And it is a political film, but not in a way that we've been talking about.
Yeah. I think that there's a way in which the release of that film, there was so much about the release of that film that gave people permission to respond to it, and that's so empowering, and it's an kind of a complicated part of like the whole festival premiere thing, and getting good write-ups by critics. Part of it isn't just like a thumbs up, thumbs down thing. It's like, if you launch a film like that at a place like Sundance is saying like, this is a film that we think people are going to get, and then all the people that do get it or respond to it or have a feeling about it, like they're allowed to all of a sudden, and they would have been allowed to anyways, but there's still that gatekeeping I think has a lot to do with whether or not you're stamping something with uncertainty, or whether or not you're giving people permission to feel confident that their response to it is meaningful.
Yeah, it's like one less hurdle to feeling empowered in your decisions, and particularly if you're not in the film industry. Somebody saying, "What was at Sundance?" is like, okay, I can at least start at this place instead of like utter skepticism. And it's interesting seeing even in the production process, or when you're filming a documentary, like those goalposts having meaning outside of even our industry, and perhaps unfairly.
Well, I think we have reached the point where we have to raise our glasses. But what are we toasting to today?
I don't know. I was just thinking I couldn't find an easy toast because it was such a complex dialogue.
With a difficult to pin down topic.
How about Can we toast that if you want to make a dumb movie, don't pretend it's about something. Be empowered in making a dumb movie.
That's the toast.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's so complicated.
I'll
Yeah.
take you up on that. I'll take you up on that.
You know what I mean?
Go ahead and make a dumb movie.
Yeah.
but also ask questions. Can we ask questions?
Sure.
Are you interested in answers? Okay.
No answer.
And shout out to the Reverse Shotters tuning in, Chloe Lazat, Chris Wisniewski, and Ryan Swen. And also the friends of ours who keep joining us every week, no matter what time we appear and show up. We really appreciate your following us. And those who watch us, of course, sometime after Wednesday. Thanks for finding us.
And thank you both for being here. It was so wonderful.
Thank you for having
you.
me.
Cheers. Everyone's lighting is great, by the way.
I would repeat the toast, but I can't remember what I just said. Cheers.
The thing Farihah said.